Welcome. Today we are looking at another part of the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. As many of you already know, Paul experienced much persecution as he traveled throughout the Roman Empire, introducing the good news of Jesus and establishing Christian churches. It's sort of ironic that those who were persecuting Paul were simply doing to Paul what he had done to other Christians before Paul had his miraculous conversion experience with Jesus. One could say that what goes around comes around. Paul had done his own share of false accusations, throwing Christians into jail, hounding them from town to town. Before Paul became a disciple of Jesus Christ, Paul himself was a perfect example of how the world sometimes acts: hateful, vindictive, selfish, and living with the idea in their heads that everyone else is just the same as them, motivated by the same things. As we look at our passage from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 8, Paul makes several references to the persecution he and his friends had received. Listen carefully and see what Paul has to say about those who persecuted him. Is he angry? Is he vindictive? Does he want God's judgment to rain down upon his enemies? Does Paul act toward his accusers in the way they treat him, like he did before he met Jesus? Or does Paul have an entirely different and opposite approach to his mistreatment? Does he seem to be a permanently changed man from the inside out? Let's listen. You yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully mistreated in Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in spite of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, even so we speak, not to please mortals, but to please God, who tests our hearts. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Clearly, Paul was not happy about being persecuted. In verse 2, he says they were shamefully mistreated. The New International Translation says they were treated outrageously. And then Paul begins to tell about the many ways they had been shamefully mistreated. Apparently, Paul and his friends were being falsely accused in many ways. Their enemies claimed that Paul had impure motives for sharing the gospel of Jesus. They claimed that Paul was deceitful, using trickery or flattery as a way to get money out of the Thessalonians. In other words, Paul's enemies claimed that he was simply a greedy human, a charlatan, a fake, a fraud, a swindler, a con artist. The true reality? Paul was simply attempting to give the Thessalonians a wonderful free gift. He simply wanted them to believe in God's free gift of love, mercy, and forgiveness, demonstrated through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. No trickery about it, no attempt to get money, no greed, no impure motives, not even an attempt to make themselves look good and receive words of praise. from the Thessalonians. The only motivation was love, to share God's love in Jesus Christ and to care about them as human beings. How would we like it if all the good things we did out of love resulted in accusations of greed, trickery, and flattery? I suspect we wouldn't like it at all. The truth is, what Paul experienced still happens because the message is still the same. Jesus has offered redemption to the whole world, but not everyone wants to serve God. Christianity will always be a threat to those who want to serve themselves, to be their own God. Truth is, Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world. It's true, look it up. In many places, especially in communist and Muslim countries, Christians are treated like a disease, something to be destroyed. But we don't live in the rest of the world, we live here. In the U.S. and certainly in the boot heel of Missouri, Christianity is the majority religion, and even those who are not Christians have been influenced by Christian moral teachings, whether they realize it or not. Consequently, persecution is more subtle, easier to brush off and ignore. In the U.S., there's always the latest news story about a Christian being sued for refusing to do something against their religious beliefs, or a lawsuit to remove something with a Christian symbol from the public arena, claiming that it is somehow offensive to those who don't believe. Those involved are, in this persecution, are emotionally traumatized and sometimes financially ruined. And there will always be a certain amount of school and workplace persecution if we live out our faith. For instance, back in the mid-1970s, when I was in high school, one of my friends was Jonathan Hansen, and Jonathan was a year older than me, very tall, gangly, and uncoordinated, and he dressed like a geek, wearing what we called back then high water pants. But he was also one of the nicest people you would ever meet, very meek, very mild-mannered. Jonathan's father was the pastor of the local community church, and Jonathan took his faith very seriously, especially the part about forgiveness and turning the other cheek. Other students would take advantage of Jonathan on this point. In the lunch line, they would purposely bump into him over and over again, or say something nasty to him. Jonathan was no dummy. He knew it was on purpose because of his faith. So with each offense, he would respond, saying to them, I forgive you. Over and over again, I forgive you, I forgive you. It appeared that the reason for the mistreatment was the hope that Jonathan would eventually get angry and strike back, that he was really no different than them. Or maybe it was just because they thought they could get away with it, sort of like a bully kicking a dog or cat, because they can. Either way, it was my first experience of witnessing Christian persecution. The real question is, does Jesus make enough difference in our lives that we live differently? Are we faithful to Christ to do whatever he calls us to do as individuals and as a church? Do we share our faith in Jesus, regardless of how we are treated? Do we keep loving God and others? And what do we do when our faith is threatened? Sometimes the greatest threat to our faith is when bad things happen to us. We might ask, does God love me anymore? Is there really a God? In the U.S., often our faith is, in my opinion, not really challenged or tested enough. Are we faithful under fire? A few years ago, I came across a news story that reminded me of a number of people I have met over the years. It was about Jim O'Connor, a hard-nosed math teacher at St. Francis High School near Los Angeles, California. A local reporter asked some of his students, "When you think of him, does the word love come to mind?" They all hemmed and hawed. No one wanted to say what they thought of him, good or bad. When asked why, one student finally said, "He's going to see this, right?" Jim O'Connor, a 70-year-old Vietnam vet, was known to be a drudge, which was fine with him. He says he's not there to entertain students. In his words, "It drives me crazy when people think school should be fun. I mean, it's nice if it could be, but you can't make school fun." And for years, the kids thought that's all there was to it. Then by accident, they discovered a surprising secret about Jim O'Connor. A high school senior who was in charge of a student blood drive came to Children's Hospital in Los Angeles for a meeting. He said it was weird. Anytime he told anyone that he went to St. Francis High School, they all said, "Oh, you must know Jim O'Connor. Isn't he wonderful?" Wonderful? The student kept thinking in disbelief. He told the reporter it was like finding an alter ego he has. Inside the blood donor center, the student found a plaque listing all their top blood donors, including the record holder, Jim O'Connor. Then he learned something even more unbelievable. Whenever Mr. O'Connor isn't torturing students with calculus, he's on a whole other tangent, cuddling sick babies. 3 days a week for the last 20 years, Jim had been volunteering there, stepping in when parents can't, to hold, feed, and comfort their children. A nurse shared with the reporter that Jim was invaluable, that the babies tend to calm for him. They tend to relax with him. They fall asleep with him. Jim said, I just like them and relate to them somehow. Jim's never been married and has no children of his own, but he's fallen hard for these babies. "I don't want to see them alone." "You can't do that," he said. The reporter responded, "You're not a tough guy at all." To which Jim said, "I know, but don't tell my students." The news report ends with these words, "Sometimes you think you know someone, but you don't have the slightest. Sometimes you think you're learning calculus, but the real lesson is life." When Jim O'Connor's students learned of the volunteer work he did, they were surprised. To them, it was like he was living two separate lives. Hopefully, they will learn in time that he cares about them as much as the babies, just in a different way. The best way he knows how to love his students is to teach them math. In the same way, the best way he knows how to love his neighbors is to give blood. And the best way to love the critically ill babies is to hold them. This is faith in action. This is being faithful under fire. He is staying true to his calling from God, regardless of what others might think about him. He does not wear his religion on his sleeve, but he lives his faith. How do we live our faith? How are we faithful under fire? How do we respond when our faith is challenged? For all of these questions, we can look toward the Apostle Paul as our example. First, respond with gentleness. When Paul was mistreated for the sake of the gospel, he responded in gentleness. In his own words, like a nursing mother cares for her children. In other words, Paul responded with extreme gentleness. When our faith is challenged, the second thing to do is expect less from others and more from ourselves and God. Instead of lashing back at his accusers, Paul went to extreme measures to prove his loving and innocent motives. As Paul explained in verse 7, as an apostle of Christ, he had the right to make financial demands of the church members because he was doing the work of the church. But he did not. Paul did not demand that which he had the right to demand, which is what the world does. Instead, Paul only received from the Thessalonians what the Thessalonians were willing to freely give him, without him asking and without coercion, which they knew. In other words, he expected more from himself and God and less from them. And the third thing to do when our faith is challenged is to keep going and to stay faithful. Rather than shrinking back in fear and keeping to himself, which is often what we feel like doing when there is opposition, Paul was filled with courage, even more determined to share the gospel of God with all who were willing to listen. These three things are more than possible for those who love God as proof to the world that through Jesus Christ we truly are made different, permanently different, from the inside out. We are in this world, but we are no longer of this world when we live like this consistently over the years. What happens over time is we become more resilient, tough skin, gentle heart, confident, courageous, and fearless, yet still loving, not in a way that scares others. Our light shines without our even realizing it simply because it is natural. It's how we live, it's who we are. This is our end goal, to become more Christ-like over time to the point that we don't have to think much about it anymore. Much like a true story from the early days of our nation's history. An old man stood on a Virginia riverbank. He was waiting to cross the river, and since it was bitterly cold and there were no bridges, he would have to catch a ride to the other side. After a lengthy wait, he spotted a group of horsemen approaching. He let the first one pass, then the second, third, fourth, and fifth. One rider remained. As he drew alongside, the old man looked him in the eye and said, "Sir, would you give me a ride across the river?" The rider immediately replied, Certainly. Once across the river, the old man slid to the ground. "Sir," the rider said before leaving, "I could not help but notice that you permitted all the other men to pass by without asking for a ride. Then when I drew alongside, you immediately asked me to carry you across. I am curious as to why you didn't ask them, and you did ask me." The old man quietly responded, "I looked into their eyes and could see no love, and knew in my own heart that it would be useless to ask for a ride. But when I looked into your eyes, I saw compassion, love, and the willingness to help. I knew you would be glad to give me a ride across the river." The rider was touched. "I'm grateful for what you are saying," he said. "I appreciate it very much." With that, Thomas Jefferson turned and rode off to the White House. As followers and disciples of Jesus Christ, we are different. We are very special different. For those who take the time to really look, the differences cannot be missed. When we are shamefully mistreated, we respond with gentleness. We go the extra mile to prove that God has made us permanently different, and we continue to share the good news of God's great love and mercy for us, even with more courage and boldness than before. God has chosen us, and we have chosen God in return. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a wonderful week.